Welcome to Between the Cracks. We could not be more between the cracks, in fact. We are literally sitting in Mark's garage firing a kiln. And Mark is, well...
I'm a potter.
He's a potter.
No, in particular, I'm a teapot maker. So I've been making teaware for 8 years and pottery in general for 18 years. And I found my way to teaware because it's the hardest thing and it's a lot of fun.
Cool. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about wild clay. We're going to be talking about gaiwans a little bit. We're going to be talking about what it means to be like a tea master, because Mark saw some of that when he was in Taiwan and me when I was in China, because we don't really have tea masters in the West, and I think it'd be fun to chat about that. So Mark, what makes a good clay? Or let me say this, what makes a bad or a fake clay?
There's no such thing as bad clay. There are people who don't know how to fire clay properly or intentionally fire it so that it's not the best functionality for that clay, but
yeah.
There's no bad clay. And fake clay also doesn't exist.
Yeah.
If it can be fired to a temperature where it's safe to use for its intended purpose, there's no such thing as fake clay.
So what about that idea of like not safe? Because I get a lot of questions, especially on like some of the cheaper factory pots, right? People ask like, are there any additives? Is it a safe pot? Is it a safe clay? Like there's this like kind of, I don't know, maybe not superstition, but like worry or fear for people about like the safety of their clay in pots.
90% of the time, there's really no way to make clay unsafe when you're talking about tea, unless you're putting milk in your teapot, which I don't recommend.
Why?
Basically, if something's really porous, then it can harbor bacteria in the clay, which, you know, traditionally with clay wares in general is seen as being not food safe.
Yeah.
So no milk in your teapots, please.
So what about like, because people ask me about like, are there any colorants or additives? Do you have any idea like where that comes from or like what people might be like worried about with that? Because I've never heard anyone in China talking about it. But I hear it all the time from like people asking me questions like, are there any additives added?
So if it's just clay and there's no actual paint on the teapot, there's nothing that can really make it unsafe to use. There are, you know, ceramic minerals and oxides that can hypothetically be toxic, but the exposure would require you to drink 1,000 gallons of water through that cup to get even a minimal exposure. The only one that really is relevant is lead, and lead is not like cheap enough or practical enough to put into clay. And the colorants, 90% of the time, it's just slip.
What's slip? For those, I'm sure not
everyone
here is,
knows you can take liquid clay and add industrially available food safe colorants to the liquid clay and then add that to the tea wares, just like you would a paint, but it's fired. So it's still totally safe. And again, like those things are kind of expensive. So for the most part, if someone's making teaware, they're not going to be using those things if they can help it. But yeah, teaware, usually safe to use. Is it going to make good tea? It's a different question, but most things can. It's just a matter of your palate. So give it a shot.
Now, what about, because you use a single source clay, right? Or wild clay.
Yeah.
Right? But most people don't use single source or wild clays. So talk to me a little bit about that.
So the modern sort of modus operandi, the modern way that potters work is that we use a mixture of different clays from all over the world that we then blend together and make the most flexible possible product. So it can be fired at a lot of different temperatures and it fits most glazes. And the actual physical like color, appearance, and texture of the clay is a lot less important to most potters. So they just make something that's easy for everyone to use and is very safe and flexible in firing. But then it really doesn't have any character, any life, anything that the clay itself is contributing to the work. And that's something that I really care about. And I want my work to speak to where the clay comes from and learn from the clay. So I'm a very like clay forward, clay first process where most people just find a clay and then fit it into their process.
Right. So one weird thing, and we've talked about this before, maybe not publicly, but we definitely talked about it before, that in China it's really important, right? Or people think it's really important, right?
Yeah,
like
for
the
sure.
clay comes from here. It's this, right? Like Yixing, right? Everyone wants like Yixing pots because of like this like, magical kind of like Yixing clay can do this.
Totally.
And we know that contemporary Chaozhou clay couldn't be fired stably about 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So, but Chaozhou clay pots are very common. Now, we obviously know that some of that clay is imported.
Yep.
But why did they have to do that? Why can't they just use the clay that's in the ground in Chaozhou?
So it goes back to the question of if the clay is achieving the goals that you have for it. So if I was using Lizella in a wood kiln, and that was how I wanted to fire, and that was what the process that I wanted to use, Lizella would fail. It would melt, it would bloat. Bloating is like when the clay turns spongy and expands and things go wrong.
It gets little bubbles.
Yeah, so if I was to fire Lizella in a wood kiln and that's how I wanted to do it, it would totally fail. And at that point, I'd need to blend it if I want to work with Lizella. And so I would start with a 70-30 blend, 70% Lizella, 30% something else. And I did exactly that in order to change the body just enough that it's stable in the wood kiln, in which case I'm still achieving my goals and I'm still mostly using the clay that I want to use. But sometimes to achieve the goals that you're trying to, accomplish, you gotta mix it up a little.
Yeah,
literally.
And I think it's interesting because when people hear Zuni or Juni, they think it's like one clay. But again, yes, there are original or Yixing clays that have been mined, and you can get pure clay. But like places like Chaozhou, they can't, right? Like they were firing in an electric kiln and they couldn't get stable clay bodies.
Well, I can speak a little to the clay, and I don't know how controversial we're trying to get here, but within a clay seam, within a deposit, a lot of times there's going to be variation, like from foot to foot, right? There are some really, really large deposits of clay, but a lot of times it's because it's either very, very pure and therefore it's really easy to get a consistent product, or it's just like a very large deposit that they then mine and mix together to get a more consistent product.
Make it homogenized, because it is more varied.
Yeah, but the reality is that most clays that you use are going to change over time. So the Zuni clay that they're using now is not the same as what they used originally, just by nature of the geological evolution of clay, the way that it forms in the ground. You're just not going to have the same clay anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's something I think people have a hard time, like when they first get into clay and hearing about teapots, they're like, I'm looking for Zuni or Juni or Duani. Like they're asking for the specific clay, but not realizing that potter to potter, the Juni is different. Firing to firing, actually. Sometimes like we have like specific, like the same artists who are using a different batch of Juni and it comes out a little bit darker, not because they fired it differently, but it's just a different ratio. And I think it's one of those things that's a lot more complicated than people would think. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I started buying Lizella 10 years from now and Mark had gotten to a different place, because the gentleman who mines it, his name is Mark, if he'd gotten to a different like place where the clay is being dug and it wasn't quite the same, I would just figure out how to work around that. And I'm sure that they've, in China, they've dealt with the same issue where the clay changes over time, but there's an expected color and texture. It's not the exact clay. We're not like doing a oxide weight analysis of the clay to make sure that it's exactly Juni,
We're looking for characteristics.
Yeah. And so if it's got the right character, you're not faking it if you've blended the clay a little bit.
Yeah.
You're meeting the expectations of the buyer.
Yeah. Of what they expect from the clay, from maybe a pot that's 20 years old or last generation. The first one that comes to mind for me is the Da Hong Pao, or people will say it's the Da Hong Pao in the clay. It's that like groggier, like it's not just fine grain, but it has like some actual texture to it in the clay. Like, it's really pretty. I just can't imagine that's something that you could mine the exact same way every time. Like, I have to imagine there is some processing going on with clays in order to get that very specific, and it's really nice. But I think the expectation that like every time I get Da Hong Pao, it's the same clay. If that were the case, you probably wouldn't get as consistent. You wouldn't get as consistent of a pot as like, oh, when I hear Da Hong Pao, I'm expecting this textured red clay, not just a flat red clay, for example.
Yeah, and when you're processing wild clay, that basically just means like you're going to a place, you're digging clay out of the ground, and it's not something that's been manufactured or mixed or made consistent by large operations. So you start with wild clay, and a lot of times you'll have to process it to get all the sticks and random rocks and things out of it.
Yep.
And then you have to add temper. And temper is grog, like small pre-fired bits of clay or silica sand, or there are lots of other things that you can add. But the point is you have to add something to the wild clay in order to make it workable. and in order to make it fire the way that you expect it to. So it's totally reasonable that each of the clays that we know and have names for in China have the wild clay that's mined and ground and processed, and then they're adding a particular type of temper to that clay to get the characteristics that they want from it.
You know what else that makes me think of?
What's that?
Porcelain, right? Because the story, as the story goes in China, right, is only the kilns in China could fire hot enough to produce porcelain. And the reason that in England that they could only make bone china, which they had to add animal bone to it, right, in order to make it stable to fire, was because they couldn't fire as hot as the Chinese kilns.
That's not actually true.
So it also makes me think, though, like, is there a chance that the kaolin reserves were just more suitable for firing, right? It's not pure kaolin.
No.
But it was just more suitable for firing directly out of the ground.
Yeah, so porcelain is what we see as a type of clay. But the reality is that porcelain is a mixture of kaolin and feldspar, which is just stone, and then often a couple other minor ingredients. But the point is that it's not just clay, right? There are other things that are working to make it stable and usable so that you can make things in 3 dimensions and not have them melt.
Yeah.
And in England, they have a really huge, very pure deposit of kaolin. It's called Graulig, and it doesn't have enough of the other things in it for it to be usable. And so for the longest time, they thought that they weren't firing it right, or there was some missing element. And eventually, I think it was in Germany where they figured out the missing ingredient. But yeah, most of the time, deposits of clay in the ground are not immediately usable for the process you want them to be. You know, porcelain should be fired at cone 10 or, 2,400 and something degrees, really hot.
Yeah.
But the reality is you might find a white clay that fires lower than that, but if it doesn't meet those standards for what an industrial porcelain is, then people turn their noses up at it. They don't want it.
Speaking of turning their nose up, right here I have one of your Gaiwans.
Yep.
You kind of turn your nose up at Gaiwans. Right? Like you're a big teapot advocate, maybe even teapot snob, right? If we're going and turning our nose up at the pots of Gaiwan.
I mean, it's a matter of preference because I know the amount of work that goes into a teapot.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that you can't make a really, really nice Gaiwan, because you can.
Yep.
You can. But it's more about the way it's fired and about the sort of purity of form, less than the precise execution of craft, because there's only 2 elements. You have the bottom and the top. With a teapot, you have the body and the lid and the spout and the handle, and the way that all those things interact matters a lot. And so when I use a teapot, when I see a teapot, I see all of the work and thought and consideration and history that goes into that. And with a Gaiwan, I mean, you could just take any bowl and put a lid on it and then hold it carefully and strain some tea with it. It would work.
You could put water through it.
You could put tea through it.
I don't know if it, like, working is a very loose term. So the thing for me is most handmade Gaiwans I don't like, because I think you need to get to a certain skill and understanding of how to pour it for tea before you get to that threshold. And it's not just handmade, actually. There's a lot of factory Gaiwans that don't get it, where like the lip comes up on an angle and it never flares out.
Yeah.
Right? You're just going to burn yourself. There's no way
seen those.
not to burn yourself in doing that. Or the lid isn't flat enough. And so you get the lid flips over, or it doesn't pour very smoothly, or leaves come out.
So I would say that there's like an archetypal functional Gaiwan. And if you make that Gaiwan and then decorate it the way you want to, or use the clay that you want to use to make it, then you can make a really good Gaiwan. Where handmade Gaiwans often go wrong is that people want to do their own take on it. So if I want to, like, this is my Gaiwan, these are the way I do Gaiwans. I don't really have that feeling about Gaiwans. I'm going to try to make a design that works well for me and for others, but I don't have any ego about like the specific design of the way that I make Gaiwans, because it is relatively, at least,
it's a perfected form almost.
Yeah.
There's like one right way. I mean, again, you still have balance, you still have other variants and points, but like realistically, whether it's a wide bowl or an angular shape, right? So it's whether it's like bowl or a vase, it has to flare at the same point. The angle of the lid and the shape of the lid, like there is one kind of best angle. Like
Yeah.
there's not really, but honestly, I think it's the same thing too. Like the difference between like porcelain and clay. So like in my mind, porcelain is a canvas, right? A lot of like Jing Zhen, right?
Sure,
Like they're
sure.
painting on the canvas, and so like the intention there isn't necessarily that the shape is the most intriguing part, but the way that you're painting on it can be. And I kind of feel the same about a gaiwan. I mean, it's literally like a flat, perfect surface for like a landscape or some sort of like art on the side.
All right, I'm gonna get in one more dig, and then I'll contribute more meaningfully to the conversation. I feel like gaiwans are a little bit messy. Like when
You suck at pouring with them.
when you
That's a you thing. I
when
watch
you
you
pour with a gaiwan, it's just like kind of a random flow and like lots of splashing, and it's just less artful to me. Like the way that you hold it and the way that you tip your arm and everything, yeah, that can be more artful. But I feel like the actual like mechanics behind it are just not as pretty. That said, yes,
So-
gaiwans make a better canvas in my opinion because there's less mechanically going on. With a teapot, there's already a lot of stuff going on. So if you decorate a teapot really intricately, I feel like it just detracts from the other aspects of the teapot.
Yeah,
Whereas
sure.
with a gaiwan, like you can decorate it as much as you want to, and it's still going to be like equally as functional, and you can appreciate it just as much, if not, I would say more actually.
Yeah.
Because you have this simple thing, adorn it, and like it's going to work the same as the next gaiwan and the next one and the next one and the next one. So that's the way that you make them like cool and unique, and like that's how you choose a good gaiwan, is one that looks nice and works well. If you buy one that looks nice and then it doesn't work well, you're like, what the heck? This is a gaiwan. Why doesn't this work?
Yeah. I find that really hard to do with some of our factory gaiwans.
Sure.
Like there's this like threshold of like how much can it not be perfect and still be cool?
Yeah.
Because like with teapots, you don't really need perfect functionality to not burn your hand.
That's
right.
true.
You don't really like, you can have like a teapot that spills or glugs or the lid doesn't fit perfectly, and it can still be a cool starter teapot.
Sure.
With the gaiwan, if you mess up some of those kind of like fundamental things, it's almost unusable, right? Like it might as well, you just use it as a cup, take the lid right off, don't even use it as a pot.
Or you can just follow the restaurant worker philosophy, where if you can't hold it, your hands just aren't tough enough. And that's one way. I've never met a potter who had soft hands, so honestly, the first batch of gaiwans that I made, that was like the first bit of feedback I got was like, I burn my fingers every time I use it, so it's beautiful, but I don't use it. And I was just like, dang,
Yeah.
I never would have known. I don't feel much heat in my hands. I've been dealing with hot stuff for a minute now, but for softer hands, you should definitely have those things in mind and take the two considerations you need. Does it burn your fingers? And does it strain tea? Gaiwans are simple. So what we're doing is probably the simplest form of tea drinking. We have some vessels. Maybe I'm totally full of it. We've got some really nice teaware in front of us. But what I mean is in setting, we're sitting in a garage and we're using some buckets to sit on and make a table. Yeah. And sometimes this is just the best way to enjoy tea. And I've found that some of my best tea experiences are with other teapot makers and potters, because potters don't drink tea the same way tea people do.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go too deep on that, but
That may be true now in America. But if you think about like really skilled, like high level artisans or masters like in China or Japan or maybe even Korea, I don't know. They don't just have their space where they make work. They have like a separate gallery and sometimes a place where they host and like a tea house. So what you were indicating is that like potters have a more casual tea setup. But I think that's just because our culture hasn't grown enough for like you to also have your own tea house out back.
it's really the way potters drink tea for themselves, I guess, is what I meant.
Okay. Yeah.
In that if a potter's sharing tea with another potter, totally different experience than if a potter is sharing tea with a patron.
Okay.
Yeah, you can definitely level up and make some nice spaces for sure.
Yeah. It's the ultimate. I wish we had some video footage. I wish we could show you, but there's like just spaces where like, okay, you have your studio and your gallery space. Like when you have a tea house, a gallery space, and a studio where you make work, first of all, like you're already at the top, right? Like your pots are thousands of dollars. But like, I mean, you've met Alian.
So I know probably my two most important mentors are a Taiwanese master named Alian. I'll get to him in a second. and a Korean potter named Lee Kang-hyo. And Lee Kang-hyo has this beautiful studio. It's kind of a mud construction, brick construction building. And that's where he makes his work, and he glazes his things and adds slip to them. And then he has a separate building that's like a gallery. Mm-hmm. So he has wall hanging pieces and a place to make tea. And then another building where like he has a kitchen and another gallery space and sort of an inventory room. So he has all these different buildings on this property, and he has his wood kiln and the shed for the wood kiln. But the point is that, yeah, it's a totally different environment, like being in the studio versus the place where you're serving tea or even displaying work. And it takes, time and also a certain amount of acclaim to want to have those things and to be able to afford those things. And Alian really takes that to the umpteenth. Yep. So he has a property outside Taipei that's absolutely gorgeous, and he's essentially just turned the side of a mountain with a river running through it into his own personal paradise. So the first building is his studio. It has a beautiful kitchen and a bunch of really beautiful wares on the first floor and a gallery. And then the bottom floor is all studio. So that's where he makes most of his work. He has his kilns there. And then there's an entire building, an entire structure just to house a single sculpture. And then just down the way from there is his tea room, and he has the river running through it, where he actually had landscapers come in and carve out sections of the river to make it into a swimming pool for himself.
Wow.
And then he has a lotus pond and a really beautiful little courtyard area and a fourth building. Is this the fourth building now? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so a fourth building that has all tea spaces on the bottom floor. And on the top floor, it houses another series of sculptures that's one body of work. So he really just did it all the way up. And I got to be at his place for his birthday while I was in Taiwan. And it was a really, big experience for me, and I felt totally out of place. And I kind of took on a role of an assistant.
Yeah.
I started fetching water and catering to people's needs, even though I was a guest there. But it just like that felt like why I was there, even though that wasn't. Alian at the end of it invited me to like sit down and have some tea with him when everyone else had kind of left. And he asked me, why do you think I invited you here? And he told me that he wanted me to see what teaware looks like, what tea culture looks like on the highest level. And that eventually I, should be able to take that back to the States and help to be a part of the burgeoning tea culture here. I don't know if I'm necessarily, on track for that yet, but I'm hoping to be.
So for me, I kind of have a similar experience. Now, I haven't actually met him yet, but Derek has shared pictures and videos of Xiehua's space. And so Zhang Yin Chao, he makes all of our lotus leaf, like the S-curve, like kind of gooseneck looking spouted pots. He actually ran Xiehua's gallery. So like at one point he ran his gallery. He's also a potter, but he has like the separate gallery space. He's also the person who started working on the Chaozhou pots about 20 years ago now to refine them so that they could be used and fired stably. And again, same kind of thing. Like he had a separate gallery space where you could host people and you could have like studio exhibitions and things like that, rather than your pottery studio space. And I haven't made it there yet. The second is a little bit different. Master Kumin's space. Now, Kumin, he's a really generous guy. And so his studio space is kind of it's everything you would want in like a tea house space with wheels. So like it's not this like separate space, it's more of an integrated space, but he also like his apprentices are allowed to live there for free. And he's just a very generous guy. And so I think he has this idea where he like wants them to experience the full tea house feel, where he has this like outside terrace that's really beautiful. And then you can like walk in the really grand doors, of the tea house. But his is kind of integrated. So his is kind of my second one that I think of. But again, both of these people are like people who have been doing this for 20 something years in a culture that already drinks tea a lot. And Chaozhou was already making pottery. They just hadn't been doing teapots because of the stability issues with firing them.
And I want to touch on that really quick because The clay that I use, Lizella, is seen most of the time in the South where the clay is mined as either a sculptural clay or earthenware clay, sort of terracotta.
Okay.
Something that's not stable, something that can't be fired meaningfully to make things that are going to last.
Yeah.
And that was all I ever heard. And it was just kind of an inclination that I wanted to try different techniques for firing it to see if it could be fired to maturity. Mm-hmm. And that's why I say there's no bad clay. Because it's really not a matter of the inherent characteristics of a clay.
Yeah.
It's really just a matter of finding out how it can be fired, if it can be fired to maturity, and then if it has problems once it gets there.
And so for people who don't know, or people who maybe already have an idea about like firing to maturity or vitrification. So
Sure.
I think when most people think of vitrification,
Yep.
they think of porcelain. Most people understand it is like being glass-like. When it looks glassy, and porcelain, maybe we'll talk about Red Forge a little bit later, but you flick the side of it, it has really high-pitched sound. You're like, okay, like it looks glassy, has this high-pitched sound, it's vitrified. But it doesn't need to look like that. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the issue, is like most people don't understand, like, again, we're talking about a purplish clay here, but I think that's one of the issues. Like when people think like, oh, maturity means porcelain and vitrification means porcelain, and then we could step it down a little bit and get to stoneware, which is semi-porous but not quite as porous as earthenware, like a planter's pot where water's going to fall all the way through. I think I've described it like that in the past to people, but it's funny because the more we've talked, the more I've come to the understanding that earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain don't really mean anything.
Yeah, the distinction is based on the way that things used to be fired in a way that we think is functional.
Yeah.
Stoneware needs to be fired to cone 10. Hot. Really, really hot.
Yeah.
And porcelain needs to be fired above that even. And then anything below that is not functional. And in the modern age, when we have access to all sorts of materials and all sorts of technology, and we can fire things in many different ways, not a million, it's really just a matter of figuring out what the clay can do. And so I've kind of come up with a different system, at least for myself.
I love it.
An earthenware is a clay that has 5% or higher iron.
Yeah. And to give some context for it, those clays that have 5% or more iron are going to look very red. So what people would traditionally be like, oh, that's terracotta, or like that's unusable. It's because of the high iron content that it's red.
Yeah, but the caveat with me saying that it matters more how much iron is in a clay, it means that it's meaningless what temperature it's being fired to.
Right.
So some terracottas, some red clays, earthenware clays, will be low fire clays, and you can't fire them very hot. But then others, you'll be able to fire quite hot. Lizella can be fired to cone 10 in an oxidation environment, in an electric kiln. That means oxidation. I can't do too many of the terms because we'll be here all night.
Yeah.
But in one way to fire it, I can fire it all the way up to the temperatures they say is safe, and it's still porous. It's not safe. But then I can fire it lower than that in a gas kiln, and it is safe. And that's where like the epiphany came that I could use this clay for what I wanted, teaware. So earthenware, 5% iron or higher.
Yeah.
That's how I describe it. Stoneware is going to be between 5 and 1% iron, and then less than 1% is porcelain, because at that point you have almost no iron, and it's going to be white.
Yeah.
Because there are other impurities that you can get that'll change the color of a clay, but they're much less common.
Yeah. And I think have you ever heard Jonathan describe how he describes porcelain?
No.
So he's such like an artsy, just like talk slow arts. Like he's like just sweet and gentle. And I think the way that he describes porcelain is the same. Where he thinks of porcelain again by the purity, or in this context, the amount of iron, right? And so when you're mining the purest form of kaolin, or close to the purest form of kaolin, that is porcelain, because everything has flown through it.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas like earthenware and stoneware, things get kind of clumped up in it, and it gets mucked up, and that's why it doesn't necessarily look as pure, is because there's other components in there that make it look less pure. But it goes to that same idea that like it's based on the purity, and not purity as in like porcelain is better, just like literally the amount of things in it. In this case, we're talking about the amount of iron in it that give that different coloration.
Yeah, I'm gonna just like a tiny tangent.
Yeah.
Kaolin is essentially the whitest of the clays, right? There's nothing in it. It's just white clay.
Yeah, which would also be kaolin or gaolin, I think is another
Yeah.
like pronunciation. It's all where like porcelain comes from. Is this like this heavy concentration of kaolin, gaolin,
Yeah.
kaolin, whatever else. Yeah.
Yeah, so kaolinite is
Yeah.
the clay mineral.
Yeah.
You have other clay minerals that make different clays. So ball clay, very easy to work with. There's often some ball clay in porcelain, but it's primarily kaolin. And then you get into other types of clays, and they're going to have different amounts of impurities. But kaolin, the main ingredient in porcelain, is going to be the purest. And then it sort of trickles down from there with iron and other things present.
Zhehua, right? When you think of, so there's two main places. Like when you think of China and you think of porcelain, there's two main places. One is Jingdezhen, obviously.
Yep.
They're typically more known for their adorned, shiny, glazed, vitrified porcelain, right? Like this just shiny and kind of very elegant looking. Now, Zhehua was typically unadorned. But the Zhehua, like the one you have, the mutton fat, right, the jade, is kind of a new thing.
Yeah.
It's not like it's been around forever, but it's matte instead of being glossy, which for me is like the most satisfying thing ever. And you have that cup. I know that you like that cup.
Love it.
Yeah, the matte. I just like sometimes the glossy, especially like with really really fine porcelain, just it doesn't feel good.
I mean, if I wanted glass, I would buy glass.
This guy. Anyway, so what do you think they're cutting the Zhehua porcelain with? Because it's not just like, oh, well, Zhehua porcelain naturally is like that, right? So they're probably cutting the porcelain with.
So the other thing with processed clays and unprocessed clays is that you have non-homogeneous particle size. So a wild clay is going to have grit. It's going to have different shapes of clay particles. It's going to have all different sorts of sizes of things.
Yeah.
And that can be a boon. It can make it a lot stronger. It can make it a little more plastic. But it also makes it more inconsistent, so you can't fire it as hot. And there are other things that go into that. Part of the purity and the beauty of porcelain is that it has a very homogeneous particle size.
Yeah.
They're crushing it and grinding it down to get that even, very, very fine particles so that it's that smooth, beautiful, peerless, perfect surface.
Yeah.
With something like B-mix, that's what we call it in the West, which is basically white stoneware, you have different particle sizes. So you have some grit and some grog or some silica sand or other particles in there that aren't specifically clay. And that's how you get things that are bright white and really beautiful, but have a different textural experience that isn't just glassy.
And for some more context for anybody who is more familiar with like the Chinese wares, that's also why I like Qinzhou clay so much. The grain structure is very homogeneous, and so you get this smooth clay. It's also the same reason the Qinzhou clay is going to be the one that interacts the least with the clay or changes the flavor, because it is homogeneous, so they can fire it tighter, basically, right? So it's tighter. There's less room for that porousness than you would get in like Yixing or Chaozhou. And Zhenshui is also more like Qinzhou in that nature as well. But that's one of the reasons why I like Qinzhou, is that really satisfying smoothness, which comes from it being more homogeneous.
Yeah, and you can do things that make a rougher clay look smooth, but it's never going to look the same as a clay that has a finer particle.
Well, so my first teapot from you. So Qinzhou clay, smooth on the outside.
Yep.
You're not usually normally running your finger along the inside. And so for me, the light bulb didn't really go off in my head until I saw one of yours. If you feel the inside of a Qinzhou pot, it's rougher because they're not sanding it down at all. So yes, it is finer particle, but you sand down your lids. And the Lizella, it looks very rough. Like when I first got my pot in from you, I'm like, oh man, how's the lid gonna be? And you spin it and it's just smooth, right? And that's one really easy way, not easy, but one simple way to get from like a very rough surface to like a very smooth surface on a lid and the top of the gallery of the pot.
Yeah, fit and finish, you should always do well, no matter what the texture of your clay is.
So what do you think? Should we check on this kiln?
Yeah, actually.
All right. It's time for us to go drink more tea and make some more pots.